Okay, hey everyone. We're here for the Managing Air Compliance Refineries. Should be about a half hour, maybe a little more. We've got essentially what we're going to go over is there's multiple applicable federal regulations at refineries. We're going to go over ones related to CEMS, and then you have other ones for boilers and heaters have their own. You got flares with their own. The FCC's got its own. The SRU. So we're going to briefly just go over what are all the federal regs and what are the challenges of complying with all of them at the same time, which is quite a challenge, to be honest. So let's see. This is me. I'm Eric Wiley. I'm a senior air compliance specialist with VIM Technologies. At VIM, we make data acquisition systems, and then I'm part of our Compass team, which is our compliance optimization team. So we help our clients comply with regulations like this, review all their CEMS data, look for any anomalies, any outliers that don't seem proper, and try and get explanations for this data. Sometimes it's legit. The data is just you have a spike, or other times there's some other alternative reason for that anomaly. So we want to make sure we get the data flagged properly, because it's all about flagging the data in your DAS with the proper flag so that you can put it in the proper category. Say for downtime, if it's downtime, what kind of downtime is it? Is it a malfunction? Is it a system upset? So there's, y'all know if you do reporting, there's different buckets you have to put this data into. So that's what I help do. We're going to go over an air compliance overview, essentially what regs you have to comply with and what are those challenges, brief summary of that, and then any questions you guys have. Feel free to ask those questions while we're going through the presentation, or you can wait till the end and ask them then. Either way is fine with me. A little bit about VIM. Like I said, we're a data acquisition company, so we have data acquisition software in our Compass team. That data acquisition isn't always just CEMS. You might have comms data coming in, or CPMS, or other process data that feeds into your DAS. And then also for our Compass team, other than we do a lot of audits, we have a colleague right now doing common audit findings. We do a lot of QA/QC plans. If you attended the class training yesterday, I'm a big advocate of a robust, compliant, useful QA/QC plan. So we do a variety of tasks. Just essentially what we try and do is help. A lot of the environmental staffs are understaffed, and so we come in as an outside resource to really help with their job. So it's easier at the end of the quarter and end of the semi-annual period or end of the year to assemble all the information you need to generate your reports. So let's have an overview of what air compliance looks like for a refinery. You have numerous applicable federal regs. You have different source types at the facility, which again have different regulations applicable to them. You have local, state, and federal regulations. You might have a consent decree. There's other drivers just besides your permit that's going to determine what you need to comply with. Like I live in Southern California. We have a program called Reclaim. It's a cap and trade program that refineries need to comply with. Flares have different requirements than do boilers and heaters. Some monitoring systems, you have CEMS, you have comms, CPMS. Your CEMS and comms require QA/QC plans. And then you have system engineering and documentation. Your reporting, excess emissions report, big one. Your CEMS downtime report is another big one. And that's where our software comes in to help you assemble that information. A lot of times, as you may know, maybe the logbooks aren't properly filled out, or there's a lot of missing information when you're trying to find out about downtime. So we can add those flags to the data so that when you run reports, you'll get the information you need, not only the downtime, but what category does it fall in. So you got federal regs. You have 40 CFR Part 60, Appendix B, which are the performance specifications, Appendix F, which are the quality assurance requirements. Then you have a RSR, so that's going to include your J and JA federal regs. Part 63 CC for your flares, and then Part Triple U. If you see the different source types, you'll know as well as I. You have your flares, your FCCU, Sulfur Recovery unit, your boilers and heaters. All these types of equipment have their own set of regulations, but a lot of times that those reporting requirements are going to overlap. Sorry, I'm a little agitated from having to wait for an additional 30 minutes. For your flares, the applicable regs, you have a specific monitoring and record keeping QA provisions that are specified in Part 60's Appendix B and F. Then you have Subpart JA that are applicable to flares, and especially Subpart CC, 63CC. CC on its own, it has a litany of monitoring requirements related to pilot flame monitoring, flow rate monitoring, and flare vent gas or flare gas composition. So CC in itself requires has a lot of requirements to it. For the FCC, you've got both Part 60 Subpart J and JA, Subpart Triple U, and then you have Appendix B and F. For the sulfur recovery units, again, you have the Appendix B, Appendix F, Part 60. So that's where you have like the Part 60, Appendix F, that's where your daily cows come in, CGAs, your annual RADA requirements. Subpart J and JA have some specific requirements, and then Triple U have some other monitoring requirements and reporting requirements. So you can see you have a variety of units with their own specific requirements required for them. And then for boilers and heaters, you've got JA and JA as well. You have Part 60. You also may have Part 75, like if you're maybe you're in the ozone season or you're in Part 75 year round. So that's where it makes it more challenging, because you're going to have data points for your Part 60 data, and then you're going to have data points for your Part 75 data, and those are going to be separated data points in your data acquisition system. So it's important to ensure that you're not using the same data point for Part 60 compliance as you are for Part 75, because Part 60 doesn't have any data replacement procedures. If your unit's down, it's just downtime, and there's no data populated there. But if you're Part 75, any downtime you have, there needs to be replacement data added in there. So it's really important to check. Maybe you can have a double check when you get back to ensure that the data you're pulling for Part 60 compliance and Part 75 compliance, that they're not pulling from the same data point. They have different monitoring types and QA/QC plan requirements. So you have CEMS on a majority of your systems here, so that's where that Part 60 comes into play. Probably have opacity on your FCCU. There may be other opacity, but I know in my experience, the FCC or FCCU always has opacity monitoring on it, so that has different work requirements than the CEMS. And then you'll have like CPMS, where you're monitoring firing rate, fuel flow rate, temperature. One thing you want to make sure is your CEMS all need a QA/QC plan, and your comms all need a QA/QC plan. And then Part 60 requires a QA/QC plan. Part 75 requires a QA/QC plan. So what I always recommend to do for that QA/QC plan is combine it into one comprehensive document. Maybe start with all your Part 60 requirements, and then what I've done for my clients in the past is I'll make an appendix for the additional requirements of Part 75, and that way you have everything in one comprehensive document, so it's easier to manage. At least I find it that way myself. And you don't have to keep all your procedures as part of your hard copy. You can just have an appendix that references all of your procedures and then store those on your drive at the facility. And that way, if you make changes to those procedures, as long as the title doesn't change, then you don't have to make any changes to your QA/QC plan. I think that's a good way to manage the procedures. For reporting, all the applicable regulations we've discussed, they have their own specific reporting requirements. And like I said, there's a lot of regulatory overlap. So if you look at like your Title V report and then your Part 60 data assessment report for your CEMS and comms, they both require the CEMS downtime reports and excess emissions reports. So you can satisfy the requirements of your Title V reporting and Part 60 reporting, with one comprehensive report. Also, you have your QA reports for your CGA and linearities if you're Part 75. Your data acquisition system should be able to generate those reports, no problem. How many of you guys are Part 75 at your facility, or do you know? Anyone? All right. Well, hopefully you're not, because it's much more stringent than Part 60. So Part 60 on its own is enough to comply with, but Part 75 is a little more stringent.
What would have you subject to Part 75?
It depends where you're located, and then if there's some ozone season requirements. Like I have a client in Indiana who's Part 75 on their boilers just in the ozone season. So there can be different federal regs that apply that would drive you into Part 75 for a temporary basis from May to September. And so when that happens, your reporting requirements and your obligations of compliance, they really multiply quite a bit, and it makes it challenging to task. That particular client, I go on their database and review all their CEMS data on a weekly basis, just because they have 26 units, and that's a lot of data to manage. So we were able to remote access in and help them manage that, so that we can point out to them when there's questionable data. And then, like I said, sometimes that questionable data, it's legit. It's something you have in excess emissions. Other times there's a malfunction that hasn't been identified yet. So we'll help them kind of put fires out before they become big, or determine whether or not they have a compliance issue. And yeah, the automated report generations is very helpful. I mean, it's you enter the time and you click the button, especially for CGAs and like your RADA. So it makes it a lot easier. When I was at the refineries, all we had was Pi. And so we would export all the Pi data to Excel and then perform our calculations on the Pi data. But then it's not real time. Sometimes the calculations aren't real time. So then you determine you have an excess emissions, but it happened yesterday. So it really, I think it adds a lot of ease to a complicated situation when you're able to get the software help. So due to the enormous amount of air quality compliance obligations, sometimes it's very important, or there's a good option of getting some expert consultant support. Obviously, we can provide that support. I'm not here to sell you that support. I'm just saying there's expert support out there if your facilities need it. So sometimes if you see, or your team, the environmental team is really undermanned, sometimes it helps to get that outside support to help minimize the workload. So, that way you can not overlook some compliance issues. You have a training. I think training on the applicable regs is key. That way the people at the facility know what the regs are and what their requirements are. And then communication between the environmental team and the instrumentation team is key. With the audits, I think the CEMS program audits are a really good idea, because sometimes, I don't know your facilities, but I've been to a lot of facilities where, we've always done it this way, or this is the way we've always done that procedure. Well, just because you've always done it that way doesn't mean that way it's compliant. So getting an outside set of eyes on the CEMS program is an enormous help. I mean, I really enjoy doing the audits, because I used to be a technician, and then I've been the environmental manager. So I know kind of the nuts and bolts all the way across. So I enjoy doing them. But like I said, there's a lot of qualified people out there, and getting a CEMS program audit, you can find the holes in your program before an actual inspector comes out and finds them for you. So I think it's a really good idea. It's kind of like if you attended yesterday, it's preventative maintenance. You're doing preventative maintenance on your program by having an outside set of eyes come in and look at it and see if there's holes in it that you didn't see before. Some of the challenges for the industry, if you have so many regulations, if you think about it on the federal side alone, there might be 5 or 6 different regulations that you're required to comply with. And it might even be more than that, depending on where you lie and which state you're in. Each of them have very complicated reporting requirements and compliance requirements. Also, if you have facilities, say you're refining Marathon, BP, ExxonMobil, you have facilities in different states, in different regions of different states. So the requirements in California aren't going to be the same for a refinery in Arizona or in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has its own set of rules. California has its convoluted own set of rules. I mean, I work there. There's 32 districts that have 32 different sets of rules. So within California, if you're in the Central Valley, you have different requirements than if you're in Southern California. So it's important to know, not just have one block that all the facilities follow. It's got to be customized to each location, and it also incorporate your consent decree requirements. That additional reporting there. Another thing I think is key employee risk. It's essentially what I've learned through doing some audits and in my experiences. A lot of times there's a guy who has all the experience. He's the one, he knows all about the CEMS. He's been there since it's been installed, and whenever there's an issue, so-and-so you'll go to see old Bob. Well, what if he leaves and there's not adequate training for staff and he takes all of his knowledge with him? You know, that's a real risk for compliance, non-compliance, I should say. And there's some other current additional risks. So regulations, as we discussed, you got a bunch of different federal regs, you got state regulations, you might have regional regulations, you might have a consent decree. It's challenging figuring out how to best utilize limited resources. I know, in my experience, both the instrumentation side and the environmental side, they really get stretched thin. And so it's important to recognize when you're getting stretched thin. Some of those answers could be enlisting outside help or requesting additional internal help. It's just being able to, you need to be able to capture how thin can you be stretched until, again, it becomes a real compliance risk. You got state to state and permit differences. So like I said, just in California, depending on where you are, you're going to have different regulatory requirements. One thing I think is very important for the environmental department is you need to have a comprehensive understanding of your Title V air permit. And the only way to do that is to go through it and read every condition for each unit. And you're going to see a lot of the same repetitive stuff in there, but each unit, depending on the type of unit, it's going to have specific requirements within those conditions that really need to be known. And the only way to do that is to read through your permit with a fine-tooth comb and make sure you don't miss anything. I mean, your obligations for compliance really are just driven by the location of your facility, and then what other external, besides federal regs, what other regulations are driving your requirements. With the consent decrees, certainly I put may require additional monitoring. I think without question, you're going to have additional monitoring with consent decrees. And I think since a consent decree has been issued, you know, you have increased visibility at your facility because a consent decree has been issued. So compliance with your other regs is important, but also placing an emphasis on those specific consent decree requirements is very important. You have multiple compliance calculations and limits. So like, again, if you're complying with Part 60 and Part 75 at the same time, you want to make sure that that data is being driven by specific regulatory data points, because they differ. Even though you're reading your ppm of NOx and that's turning into an hourly average, you can't use that average in Part 60 and Part 75 at the same time, because they can vary based on whether there's CEMS downtime or whether there's equipment malfunctions. Also, the reporting with the consent decree can add a lot of additional responsibilities. So understanding your consent decree, just like understanding your Title V permit, it's very important. And I know I keep using the word very important, or the phrase, but you can't overemphasize knowing what your reporting requirements are and your monitoring requirements are.
Have you seen terminated?
Yes, I think many is a bit of an exaggeration. I've seen 2 consent decrees terminated.
So it's possible.
Yeah, we have a client right now who's in the process of getting their consent decree terminated as well. So it's not unheard of, but it's not going to get terminated if you haven't demonstrated to the utmost of your ability that compliance is important, and that it's something that your facility takes seriously. So some key employee risk, you can have ways to mitigate that are procedures. So everything that old Bob knows, how to work on the CEMS, how to do a CGA, how to do a linearity test, that all needs to be documented in procedures. And then you house that in your QA/QC plan so that the best way we used to do procedures when I was training new staff is I would go out and do a CGA, and then I would write that procedure, and then I would give it to the new guy and say, okay, go out and do a CGA. And there, without question, every time there's holes in my procedure because I'd done it 100 times. So I left out, first thing you do is open the door, push the maintenance button. Like I left out so many steps, and I only focused on what you had to do for the CGA itself. So a good way for the procedures is to have the people doing the work actually write the procedures. Engineering documentation. So here at VIM, we provide every data point tells you which other data points it's connected to, as well as how the calculation utilizes each of those data points. And I think most of the other DAS vendors have similar paperwork, but it's important to remember reviewing that paperwork you can't, even though I work for a DAS company, you can't wholeheartedly trust that everything's programmed in your DAS correctly. You need an expert set of eyes to go over it after you receive it from your DAS company, because what we're going to do is we're going to go off your permit and go off information you've given us. And sometimes that information isn't exactly correct, but it will get translated over into the programming because that's the information we've received. So it's really important to maybe annually, biannually, go over the programming within your DAS to ensure that it's accurate. Make sure the proper calculations are being done. Make sure it's being done on a dry basis and not a wet basis. You know, that's also a common finding is you're calculating emissions on a mass, but on a wet basis instead of a dry basis. I think getting training really helps mitigate the key employee risk. So that means training on the analyzers in use, regulatory training from an expert, an internal expert, if you have them at your facility or within your company, but getting training on the regulations and how to utilize the equipment properly is important. Operating under a COVID environment, I think it's been pretty challenging due to all the remote access and maybe things that would be caught on a regular basis when you're at the facility kind of falling through the cracks. So that's why I think operating under this COVID environment, although it is changing, that's for certain. Look for those minute details and look for those fine things that would be easily looked over, because when you're not at the facility with your finger on the pulse, it's easy to overlook a lot of those items. So some of the key takeaways is you want to understand the risks involved. So there's an assortment of challenges you might have to navigate which contribute to your compliance risk. This can range from regulatory requirements, but to less obvious key employee risk, and even recent policies that modify virtual working. You have you want developing procedures. Sorry, let me do this. That's good. So you want to develop procedures and best practices. I think the best way to transfer knowledge is to get well-written procedures and then review those procedures on a regular basis. Because, you know, if I write a procedure, let's say today, and then I go through and utilize that procedure over an annual basis, maybe by the end of that year, I figured out a way better way to perform that task. So reviewing those procedures is really helpful. You want to simplify the data capture and reporting. A way to do that, I think, is reviewing what's programmed within your calculations and where is your data going. You know, once you pull in your NOx reading, once you pull in your O2 reading, make sure that the calculations are being done properly. You know, more than likely they are being performed properly, but there's a time where something may have been missed, and that can have, you know, big results. You want to allow for changes in growth. Keep your program flexible to bring in new people and have good training in place to ensure that they know what they need to know, and just continually review. Keep your eyes on the regulations. Regulations change. You know, you can sign up for the EPA notifications. You can go there on a. We have a person that goes onto the EPA website on a daily basis to look for changes in rules, potential changes in rules, or discussions about changes in rules. So if you know that changes in rules are coming, you can follow it more closely, so that therefore when it becomes implemented, you're already on top of the ball. That is it. I didn't go over, so I don't think I quite made it to a half hour either. You guys have any questions? I would say it's quite similar. I mean, the applicable regs might differ, but again, each of those are going to have different requirements. Knowing the requirements of each of those, and then, I mean, I'd hate to say it, but you want to prioritize and find ways where you can combine those requirements so that you're not doing the same thing 3 times for 3 different regulations. You know, it's kind of understanding what are the regs that are applicable, and then how can you best manage those and kind of consolidate those requirements. Like the example I gave is your Title V report. In your Title V report, you have to include all your excess emissions and all your CEMS downtime. Well, you have to do the same thing if you're a Part 60 facility for your data assessment report. So you can set up a tool, you can utilize your DAS, and that way you're complying with your like, what's the proper word? You're completing the task at one time instead of doing it 3 different times. And getting training on the regs, I think, is key. You know, we offer training. There's a lot of good other companies that offer really good regulatory training out there as well. So I'd for sure recommend getting training. And internal training as well, if you have resources. I know I used to do a lot of work with ExxonMobil, and there's a really good team of experts in Houston that helps train the environmental personnel at other facilities. And I think that's a great resource that they take advantage of. So you can check internally as well to see if you have any internal resources. Anything else? Anyone else? Yeah, I mean, it depends how many inputs we're getting, you know. It could be between 40,000, it could be 150,000. It just depends how much data that we need to manage. That's the biggest driver, is how much data is coming in, and then how much of that data do we need to manage? How many calculations do we do? How many caveats are there? You know, sometimes you need to do a calculation one way, but then to comply with something else, you have to do it a separate way. So there's a lot of caveats in there that can really vary the price. But yeah, I mean, for a refinery, but how's that?
What instruments you have to replace with?
Yeah, exactly. Are they smart instruments? Are they not smart instruments? Are we pulling in the information from the analyzers themselves? So there's a litany of possibilities out there. So that I could even be off. I mean, to be honest, I sell the compliance services. I don't sell the DAS. It seems like I'm more and more being asked to, but but yeah, it really varies. At a chemical plant, we could pull in, depending on the number of units, we could pull in five CEMS into one DAS. That's probably with 75 data points on each CEMS. So that's enough. You don't want to overload the DAS with too much data, because it's going to bog down the operation. So we always try and keep, you know, again, the number of data points, not to max it out. You know, you want to leave a buffer on the end for mainly for data storage, because the memory, the more data you have coming in, the more memory gets used up, and you have to find ways to store that previous data. I have my card up here. If you guys think of anything questions you have, if you think of anything related to CEMS compliance, you can feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. That's it.